So Dr. Angelo Martin, Stephen Dowling and David Dielger. Okay, so really, actually what we might do, we might take a row, I might take one microphone off, just switch the other two between you, and I'll do a roving mic. So is there any questions coming out of your discussion around the room that you'd like to ask the panel? Sorry. Oh, just with the live streamers, that's all.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Sue Ellen Taylor from Culture Code. And I'm not sure if it's kind of comment or question, but one of the things, and it came out in our conversation here, was that we seem to talk about it in three levels, as in the organisation, the managers, and then the staff. And it's sort of like mental health is an issue that staff have, whereas mental health, you know, as an executive, and you're not making decisions because you're not sleeping properly and things like that. So one of the things we talked about was having good support from managers being trained well to have the conversation. Is there a danger of kind of not considering management and executive level in all of this, in making sure their mental health is stable and resilient?
I think that's an excellent point. So I might start off with that because I've worked a lot in educating managers. And so one of the things I really focus on too is thinking about the self-care, because again, research shows the more stressed a manager is, the worse the work climate is, because there's this kind of contagion that occurs with mood and a whole range of other sort of processes that can, in a way, present a psychosocial risk for the workers if the manager is very stressed or unwell. And like I mentioned, being in middle management is shown to be particularly stressful because you're, responsible for the KPIs, but, you're also managing employees that have all sorts of different issues. So I think that's a critical piece, is the well-being of managers. So it's a very good point.
In terms of my feedback to that issue, and a practical example, we're working with large car manufacturers that are now closing their plants. For this organisation, they've closed 3 plants around the world in their history, so you can imagine the impact that this has on a workforce of 2,500 people. So what we tend to do is we tier solutions at different levels of the organisation, and certainly all of the work that I've created over the last 25 years came from the mining industry, where I saw people having to put people out of work through no fault of their own, people that they'd grown businesses with, that worked together for 20 years of their life, and the impact that it had on them. They were deeply affected by the change that was ahead of them, and they were asked to lead that change. So we've worked with organisations that are going through complex change where they have to, once again, through no fault of their own, deliver bad news, ask hard questions. You can still do that with care and support of your workforce up and down the chain of command, and also the unions, stakeholders, suppliers, customers that dovetail into and out of that business. The ripple effects across organisations when these sorts of things hit are significant, and depression, anxiety and the other issues that we raised hold no boundaries. They cross organisations, they cross society at all tiers, at all levels, all shapes, sizes, cultures and ethnicities. So it has to be broad and help those in need as quickly as possible.
And finally, just from a legal perspective, what I often see is, particularly for executive employees, as soon as a mental health issue is raised, it's pretty much the death knell for their career, and you get a payout, a large notice period, but it's pretty much it. And what that means is your board and your executive team need to focus on their due diligence, and we all know that for officers, it's a new standard. It's $600,000 and you can go to jail. And I know we're not that close at the minute for a mental health prosecution, but believe me, mark my words, you were here the day when we said it will happen. And so what that means is the internal support needs to be better from the executive team, but more importantly, if you are on a board or you report to the board, that board needs to protect themselves legally by understanding how they deal with executives.
Probably the only other comment I'd like to add is we're sort of sitting at the front of here and we're sounding like big business. Once again, that's whilst we consult occasionally to big business and mining, oil and gas and utilities pay the bills for the Dowling family, we work with organisations, not-for-profits, charities that can't afford consultants, and we get in there and help them and share our learning along those lines. So we work with multinationals and global organisations, but we also work with not-for-profits, small, diverse organisations, all the way down to childcare centres, hairdressers, very, very small micro businesses, because they're suffering as well. They're suffering from the stresses and pressures of trying to manage a very small micro business, and we try and get in there and help them with products and services that support their journey and recovery to wellness.
Thank you. Question number 2 over here to Neil.
Thank you, Cameron. Neil Johnson, Small Business Safety Systems. I usually work at the front end where it starts, and they've never had a claim before, and it ends up a mess. And I eventually go to David when it gets heavier and heavier, get free coffee for only 2 minutes. But I have witnessed a lot of situations at work where the person you've spoken about has been quite strong. They never report anything around the mental health issue, the depression, the anxiety. And a cast of thousands gets involved in 5 minutes. You've got a GP, you've got a rehab consultant, they're not all available. You've sometimes got a union rep, sometimes the union's got a particular political issue of that day, like yesterday, which inflames it. And I've found that the job that I've finished up doing has sometimes ended up being a chairman of this unruly bunch who have lost sight of the poor person who's embarrassed about this whole situation in the first place. So I probably end up becoming a bit bossy, not a bully, about trying to put a program back in place that's centred on that person for them. Have you got any suggestions, or am I heading the right way, or suggestions on how to keep that group under control? Because they're different.
I think you're right with a number of people. So someone has to be, I think you've hit the nail on the head too. There's the client-centred or the employee-centred approach. So the coordination is critical. So congratulate you, I think, on the approach.
Neil, I think it's absolutely, I talked about having the plan, and I think the majority of it is well-intentioned, unplanned reaction. And so the person with the plan will be the person, if you're strong enough, which I know you are, just to simply say, here is the plan. I reckon that will adjust more people's thinking, because I don't think they're actually being deliberately obstructionist. I just think they're rudderless and they don't know what's going on. That's why they keep on mucking it up and just choosing whatever the solution the last person who spoke to them was. But if you say, here's the plan, and can actually, with some degree of certainty, forecast the likely steps, that gives people the certainty and it gives you the solution. And as I said earlier in my talk, if you're focusing on results with respect, you can see a plan coming through. Most people go, they have to leave because they've got no other solution.
And it's quite interesting. I'll dovetail into your safety background. You'd use ICAM investigation tools, those sorts of things? No? Well, yeah, okay. An ICAM investigation tool looks at what events occurred before an incident, during an incident, and beyond an incident. And for those that sort of use that methodology, it's exactly the way you described it. After it goes bang, you'll see a cast of thousands involved. But when you look at who was involved and who was trying to help before the incident, very few people. And what you will find is that people, particularly when they saw the issue, they were aware of the issue, but they chose to look the other way rather than get involved. A lot of the times it's because they lack the confidence, they lack the skill in terms of, say, mental health first aid or a response, or they lack a plan. So then you find yourself at the incident where things have gone bang, and then you see the amount of energy that's applied after the event. My view, I think you've had some great advice around putting in place a method that you can, when an incident occurs, how do you respond? How do you keep the person at the focus of the concern, managing their privacy and confidentiality and reinforcing that? In other words, you become an advocate for the staff member that's affected and hold off those that are unhelpful or managing their single objective agendas, and then use the power of a multidisciplinary team, which you really have around you, to then work through what steps are important for this individual in terms of stabilising them, avoiding a crisis, and returning them to, their pre-injury, pre-illness condition, as you would use a return to work program. But it's really around negotiating, having a plan and having the confidence to be able to manage that as chair to do what's best for the individual, the organisation, hopefully the benefit of other stakeholders around the table. People just need help. They just need a plan.
Stephen touched on in his presentation the Canadian standard, and one of the really good tools that probably around this topic that exists, and Mary Ann Baton, who delivered at the UTAS conference back in October last year, ran a workshop around the tools called Supporting Employee Success, and it's about making those reasonable accommodations. But the employee, in the Canadian setting, the employee owns that document, and so they're working with their employer, but they're also working with other relevant parties. But it's the employee's tool to own and to have those conversations, and it's nice and structured. It's got some core elements of what success looks like in a workplace. And so these sorts of resources are out there, as Stephen mentioned, but very few know about them. So again, a takeaway action for us is to consolidate those resources and get them out to our networks, and that'll happen post today as well. So I've got another question up the back here.
Thanks. Peter Sharman, I'm an occupational physician in practice here in Hobart. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to David for commenting about the important role of the patient's own general practitioner in giving information and not just the fight between experts. But most of the patients that I see with work-related stress or stress that's affecting their work are in compensation systems. And my question, I don't think many of the speakers talked about the interaction between what you're trying to do in terms of mental health in the workplace and compensation systems. My experience is that compensation systems aren't very friendly towards mental health for the claimants, and I just wondered if you've got any comments on that interaction between the compensation systems and as a potential resource to help people versus the negative effects of compensation systems.
I think I have seen some research on that about worsening mental health, obviously, when you're subject to a claim or being the one who puts the claim in. So this is why we're sort of so focused on early intervention and prevention, so that it doesn't sort of get to that point, because I agree, research shows that this can actually worsen the person's mental health. So yeah, I'd say prevention and early intervention is the only thing you can do to try to prevent that and improve the system.
Yeah, look, I would say workers' comp, once it gets into that machine, it's an ugly mess, and it's because it's so prescriptive. So it's very hard to get out of that treadmill once you're on it. It's got negative connotations. No one likes to be on workers' comp, and no one likes to have a stressy. And unfortunately, it's probably the last place you want to be in. And I think resolving it outside of that system is your best. If you're the victim, that's the best place to be, is outside of that. I don't think the workers' compensation system, although it has a number of statutory safeguards, because it is process-driven, it's actually not focused on resolving or getting what I call results with respect. It's about finishing a claim, and that's the worst thing. Can't help you other than that.
Look, I'm probably going to say something provocative, and I hope this is never edited down to one sentence rather than 3 or 4. I travel and have worked internationally and globally, and I know our workers' compensation system and processes are always, there are many that throw bricks at it. But when I look around the world, Australia is extremely well placed in its workers' compensation approach and how it manages those that are injured at work far better than any other country. When I look at the systems that are in place around our states, the two standouts are both Tasmania and Victoria in terms of how they manage the workers' claim process as best they can, given its complexities and its multidisciplinary implications and the duration that it takes a person to recover and stabilise their health. So what I'm saying to you is that whilst we can throw stones at the workers' compensation system, we live in a country that has one of the best in the world. You live in a state that has one of the best in the country that has the best in the world. Therefore, we've got to work with a system that really works for the people and works for occupational physicians, allied health professionals, rehab providers, and do what's best for those that are suffering from these sorts of illnesses. I think particularly what I enjoyed about both presentations today was the looking at the end game, and if the end game is to drive people out of work, you can use any system or method to actually do that. If the end game is to try and keep people that could be suffering from an acute mental illness or a long-term mental concern at work, you can use the same systems to actually achieve those sort of outcomes. I think the involvement and the relationship and the trust that's built between both occupational physician, GP, multidisciplinary rehab provider and the claimant themselves with the workers' comp insurer is really vital to a successful outcome for that person. And my view would be we should be putting more resources and more ability into focusing on better outcomes for people rather than blaming a system that, as I said, is the best in the country, one of the best in the world. My view is Tasmania holds in its hands an opportunity to work more effectively together to demonstrate to the other main island states what's possible in utilising better practices to reduce the risk of psychosocial injury and encourage the support and care for those that do suffer.
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary, Stephen, on what today's been about. I do have to apologise up the front table and also to Ted here to my left for running out of time, but Pam's making her way up the front now to wrap up the session. And we would these panel sessions we could have no doubt gone on for much longer, and it was cut a little bit short, so apologies. But it was a pretty jam-packed schedule, so I'll hand it over to Pam to close the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the panel members. So if we could join with me just to thank them for that. So I think you'd all have to agree it's been a fascinating session today, and that's our 11th networking session for Better Work. The next one will be on the 22nd of March at the Rest Point Casino, so be sure not to miss out on that, and I will be sending out all the promotional details on that. Today, of course, is all about taking action, so please be sure to take with you the resources that we have on the table and outside, so there's heads up resources and other things there for you. Make sure you join Better Work Tasmania if you haven't already. Book an advisory service visit with WorkSafe Tasmania. That can be part of you taking some action with respect to what you've heard about today. Also, you can also join the Heads Up website. It has some fabulous resource material there. And also the Safety Institute of Australia. You might like to join the SIA and look at their website. There is a symposium coming up shortly in May. That's correct, Lauren? May, yes. So very good. There's an employer of choice assessment feedback survey also on the table, so if you'd like to fill that out. Thank you again for your participation, and hope to see you next time. Safe journey home. Thank you.